All right, everyone. Welcome back and good morning or good afternoon, whatever it is whenever it is that you're watching this. So the first big announcement is that the first exam is already upon us. Next Thursday, you will have the exam. First, I do want to mention that, remember also, look at the syllabus. The application module for application module 1 quiz is due Friday next week, so right after the exam. I'll open it today. I'll also lecture on that today as well as chapter 4. Okay, so later today I will also be posting the exam study guide. Just a brief kind of overview of the exam. It will cover chapters 1 through 4 from the textbook, a couple of terms from the Righteous Mind, Hates book, and a few terms from the application module 1. So the study guide will basically be a list of terms, and the exam will mostly be definitions, maybe a couple true and false questions, but no application questions. Well, I shouldn't say that. There will be some application questions regarding research methods. Not many, though. For the most part, it will be definitions. So everything on the exam is covered on the study guide, but not necessarily everything on the study guide will be on the exam. As I said, it will open up on Canvas on Thursday. You'll have, I believe, an hour to complete it. Yes, an hour to complete it. This semester, it's open note, open book, so just, be aware of that. So today and Tuesday, I will finish the application module 1 and the chapter 4 lecture, and then on Tuesday, as I said, I'll kind of go over some things in chapter 4 in a little bit more detail, and then I'll also kind of give sort of a mini exam review lecture that kind of just touches upon some of those kind of key themes from the chapters that, if you understand those, then you can kind of understand the rest of social psychology and whatnot. Okay. So let's see. So as I said, I'm going to talk about the application module on the social psychology of health today, and then I will... Well, first of all, and then I'll move over to the chapter 4 in the textbook. So I realized that, it's kind of a tragic irony that, you have to take this quiz the day after an exam, and basically the quiz is on how stress affects you, how, social psychology seems to manifest itself in stress sometimes. So anyway, so that's one reason why I decided to start with this today. One thing that we have to understand is that, as we have talked about, people in the West, in the United States, tend to have high levels of self-esteem. Higher than in other countries. There are questions, and I think some of you brought it up on Packback, about, whether, is that a good thing or a bad thing? It sort of depends. I think, there's this fantastic book called Bright-Sided, How Positive Thinking is Undermining America. So, we have this almost cult of positive thinking. I remember talking to people shortly after the coronavirus happened, or maybe a couple months after, things started shutting down, and they're saying how they're trying to just stay positive, and, me being perhaps the morose sociologist I am, I'm just like, why are you trying to stay positive? Now is maybe not the time to, try to be positive, but perhaps be realistic. And perhaps when you're realistic, then you can sort of, I don't know if positivity is what you get from it, but maybe less negativity. Anyway, there's a fantastic book about, about this sort of, cult of positivity we have in the United States in particular. Now, I do want to say something, though. As I said before, ignorance is bliss, and we found that, there's some truth to that. Also, people who do report higher levels of optimism tend to respond better to surgeries and recover faster. So they've done studies, and they find that people who are more optimistic tend to recover better. There is a relationship between your positive, negative thoughts and your health, and we'll talk about that. So yeah, there's, hundreds, thousands of, crappy self-help books. Honestly, I think, in these times, perhaps better guides to living come from, the 13-year-old Anne Frank, who was, hiding from the Nazis in the Netherlands. Our department is trying to set up something with the Anne Frank Foundation to possibly have a Holocaust Studies Center or something like that at Penn State. This was all happening before COVID, so kind of see where that goes. But something I want to be very involved in. Another one written around, the same time period, Hope Against Hope, a memoir by Nadezhda Mandelstam, who was married to a famous poet, and looking at Russia and basically how Russia kind of fell apart under Stalin. I spent the month of March and April reading a lot of memoirs and diaries from people, especially during the sort of the Second World War and Great Depression, and times of tremendous change. And I think those are better guides to living than the pop psych books you can pick up at or you could pick up at an airport in the past. So as I said, people who are more optimistic report better health. We also know that social connection matters a lot, and so this is something to really think about, and that I've been really kind of diving into too since COVID hit. I just happened to be teaching in Intro to Sociology, we're talking about social networks. So this is a social network analysis. Not going into it too much, but each of these squares and bubbles are people. I think squares are women, circles are men, or maybe vice versa. People who are yellow, I believe, are happier, and people who are blue are more depressed, and people who are green are in between. So I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail, but basically what this is looking at degrees of connection between people and friends and so on. And so what you find is you see a lot of clustering. You've got some, depressed people who are not really connected to anyone other than one or two other people, but a lot of them are connected to each other. So we tend to see this, and you see the same thing with happy people. A lot of happy people are connected to each other as well. So Nicholas Christakis has done some of the best work on this. He's basically a physician and a sociologist. He basically, with a guy named James Fowler, a political scientist who looks at politics and genetics, which we will talk about after the exam. I have a fantastic lecture that will blow your minds after the exam about that. Anyway, James Fowler and him wrote this book, Connected, where they did a big social network analysis. And basically they find that, being connected is a very important thing for our society. So Christakis, we're reading his work in Intro to Sociology, this book Connected, which I highly recommend. He also has a book called Blueprint that came out a couple years ago. I highly, highly recommend that as well. I almost considered that instead of The Righteous Mind, but given the political atmosphere, I thought The Righteous Mind was good. This book will be coming out, I believe, next month. So he's written, one of the first books about coronavirus. He's in a good position to do this, someone who studied social networks and epidemiology. I have this pre-ordered, basically. Okay, getting into the application module more specifically. So, what we're finding that's really kind of fascinating is that, the broken heart isn't just sort of this metaphor anymore. It's a very real thing. So we've started to recognize that people who have, some sort of emotional stressor, the divorce or the loss of a loved one, it can produce adrenaline and stress hormones, including adrenaline, but as I'll say, adrenaline's perhaps not the most important one. And then this causes chest pain and, anxiety attacks and things like that. And it can also sharply lower the heart's ability to pump blood. Now, physicians now estimate that at least 1% to 2% of the symptoms of a heart attack actually reflect a condition known as apical ballooning syndrome, ABS, and this is described in more detail in the textbook. But basically, it's epinephrine, the stress hormone, floods the left ventricle of the heart, basically swelling it to dangerous levels. Now, physicians still also believe that basically men suffer more cardiovascular disease than women. That's not true. Since 1984, we've known that women suffer more cardiovascular disease than men. Yet, nonetheless, a survey done a few years ago of doctors found that 1/5 of doctors still believe that men suffer from more cardiovascular heart disease and so on. So this, I would not be surprised if ABS is actually even that the percentage is even higher than 1 to 2%. So again, kind of talking about the social psychology here. So they did this meta-analysis, and a meta-analysis is basically a huge study of other huge studies. So this review of 200 studies found that obligations and expectations that threaten who we think we are and our connections to others are most likely to contribute to stress levels. So you can think about this just in terms of your own life. Say you experience something, where, you think of yourself as a particularly good, politically correct person, that sort of thing, and you're hanging out with some friends, and you say some term that may be seen as a faux pas. And we'll talk about this more when we talk about stereotypes and stuff and so on. But all of a sudden people think, oh, wait, that's sort of a kind of a backwards, prejudicial sounding remark. And if you view yourself as being sort of, progressive minded on these sorts of things, this is going to cause a certain amount of stress. If you think of yourself as being a good person, not prejudiced and so on, which again, we'll talk about it in detail later. But this is going to be a blow to your self-esteem, and is also going to contribute to your stress more than if you would have, gotten a Jeopardy question wrong or something like this. Jeopardy the show, which is a trivia show. Not quite sure what pop culture references will work with this, with your generation. Okay. So how does stress harm health? Through basically something called the HPA axis. Interestingly, a friend just contacted me to ask if I knew anything about it, and I was just like, I don't think so. And then I remembered that I actually do know about it. I give a lecture on it. COVID brain. Okay. Anyway, so the HPA axis is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and it really is what regulates the stress hormone cortisol. And, like I said, adrenaline, that gets all the, all the press and all the attention, and everyone's, saying that they've got a lot of adrenaline shooting through them and so on, which is obviously probably true. But it's, it's the cortisol that's really more important for a number of reasons, which I'll go over. So you have the stressful event that happens, let's say, you lose a loved one to COVID, or, you have to flee a fire in the west or a hurricane in the south or whatever it might be. This stimulates the amygdala. So, remember, the amygdala does a bunch of things. And one of the things that it does that's relevant here is that it processes information relevant to threats. We'll talk about amygdala too when we talk about political attitudes. There's some very interesting differences between amygdala functions between people who call themselves liberals and those who call themselves conservatives. Anyway, so the amygdala stimulates the hypothalamus, and that sends off a message to the pituitary gland, and that then produces the adrenocorticotropic ACTH. I always have trouble saying that during a lecture. I can say it when nobody is paying attention to me, like when I'm practicing, but even in front of us, just a screen and no one actually around. Anyway, we'll talk about that later too, how we react when we think people are watching us versus otherwise. Okay, so the ACTH, big. This is big. So ACTH is produced. So again, you got the amygdala, the hypothalamus. This sends a message to the pituitary gland. This then sends the hormones through the ACTH through the blood, the bloodstream. It stimulates the adrenal glands, which are down here on top of the kidneys, and that then releases cortisol into the bloodstream. So as I said, cortisol is this incredibly important hormone that's not given the attention it probably should. This is some of the effects of it: depression, hypertension, excuse me, decreased immune system, arthritis, hostility, chronic fatigue, a whole range of things. So like I said, cortisol has not been getting the attention it deserves. Just in other ways you can look at it: increased blood pressure, decrease in sensitivity to pain. So actually pain can worsen. Increase in blood sugar, So this is one thing to think about in terms of COVID-19. Everyone is very stressed out right now. So everyone is, probably getting some extra cortisol running through their systems, and it's probably affecting people's immune system, memory, and all sorts of things. So, could have, anyway, there will be studies done on cortisol and COVID-19, I am sure. Again, it even affects the bones, bone formation, things like that, muscles, and so on. So cortisol, this big, this incredibly important hormone that does not get the attention it deserves. So this is basically, cortisol is found in, basically all animals and mammals especially, that are, trying to, you see this in the wild, you see, an animal, and a deer, a zebra that's running from a lion, they release cortisol. It's their flight. It's the fight or flight response, basically. And it's for the zebra, it's the flight response. For the lion, the hungry lion, they have cortisol going too, but it's the fight, they need that cortisol so they can run after the zebra or this hominid here, this early hominid who's running away. So throughout most of human history, cortisol has basically been related to, running from lions, running from bears, running from other people, other, tribes and things like that. So that's been, hundreds of thousands of years of human history, that's what cortisol has been doing. Now, though, we get cortisol released when we have, an exam coming up. Your cortisol is going to go up next week, as you get closer to the exam and so on. So anyway, at least now you'll know what's going on in your body. So things we can do about it, and what other things cause cortisol to shoot around. The big one, like I said, in modern society, we're not running from lions. Unless we're dealing with, running from fires and tornadoes and hurricanes and so on. For the most part, a lot of our cortisol is released thinking about future stressful events, rumination. So basically, there's these studies that show that people who ruminate tend to suffer more from ulcers, from heart disease, cancer, cell death in the hippocampus, and a whole range of things like that. We see that, like I said, rumination tends to lead to more cortisol. So how do we avoid this? How do we avoid rumination if our life is full of stressors and obligations, which, as I said, cause a certain amount of stress? So, well, there's been some research on this, and your book goes into this in some detail. And number one, turn your attention somewhere else. Work on a Sudoku puzzle, or read a book. I can escape fairly easily into reading. Not everyone can, though, so you kind of got to figure out, maybe what it is that works for you to distract you from, thinking about some stressful event. Sometimes you actually need to tell yourself just stop, and like physically tell yourself to stop. They found that, people who say, yell, stop ruminating, stop thinking about this, sometimes you have to do that. But sometimes that just doesn't work, and you're just ruminating there. And so, and some people are just more temperamentally predisposed to ruminate. So if you are more inclined, more predisposed to ruminate, researchers say maybe designate a 30-minute time period to do it. So you just, maybe you need more than that too. Maybe you've got a lot to ruminate on, so that you're less likely to be debilitated by it. So again, all of this is a bit more realistic to me than, just thinking positively, which can be kind of a big challenge. So anyways, the book has a little subsection there. I highly recommend reading it. Your college is a stressful time, and this is an extremely stressful time in world history. So having a better idea of what's going on in terms of your body and stress may help you manage it a bit better. Other thing, practice self-distancing. I know we're all doing social distancing. Focus on your feeling from the perspective of a detached observer. So, kind of step back and think about, okay, why am I feeling this way right now? Especially when things like stress or anger or, emotions like that tend to be, tend to be more intense. Sometimes, got to step back and, kind of look at it like you're a psychologist, analyzing a patient. So the reality, though, too, is that, like I said, it's, nature nurture is sort of constantly, churning and, so on and so forth. So we have all these things that go into affecting how we are. And we know that, children raised in poverty, for example, are hit by all of these various stressors. Any one of these things can lead to more cortisol releases. So especially for people who are in poverty or some disadvantaged group, you see more of these stressors. So you see more of this cortisol release, more of the negative health, and so on. Some of the first great research on this was done by this fantastic behavioral biologist, primatologist, neuroendocrinologist, Robert Sapolsky. I highly recommend getting this book, Behave, if you're interested in this stuff. He got a MacArthur Genius Award when he was like 20 years old or something for, he spent like the next 25 years studying baboons for about 4 or 5 months. He'd go and spend about 4 and 5 months just studying these baboons. And he did this fascinating experiment where he actually finally gathered some of their cortisol. Looked at their cortisol, and he found that there's a whole bunch of stuff related to hierarchy, and we'll get into this in great detail later. But he found that cortisol was associated with heart problems and other health problems in baboons. So he did, like I said, some really fascinating research that he did there. And I'd highly recommend the book Behave. He also has a lot of great talks online. I'll post a few in the modules. I've been behind on that. I'll catch up with that. Okay, there was one talking about, as I said, hierarchy plays a role. I'll talk about this later when we talk about hierarchy specifically, but an early study of the British Civil Service found that those with lower ranked positions were 3 times as likely to die over a 10-year period as those in higher status positions. That's pretty incredible. That's an incredibly large difference. So like I said, going back to social connections and health. So people who report being lonely show higher levels of cortisol. So social connections are important. Today, as we all know, we're living in a time where we have less physical connection and more virtual connections. And so, maintaining those connections for your mental health is an important thing to do. For most people, not everyone, works this way. Some people are stressed out by more social interaction than others, but the vast majority of humans tend to require more social connections. I'm sort of in that minority that doesn't need social connections as much, which I guess is why I'm studying humans, because I find them strange. Elephants are very interesting also, and we'll talk about just because I have these pictures of elephants, not just because I think they're adorable, but the social psychology of elephants is fascinating, and we'll sort of get to it because it relates to humans in some interesting ways. So how do we know that social support helps? So there's been these studies where they've had people give speeches to an audience. Some where there was a supportive friend or loved one in the audience, and some where they didn't know anybody in the audience. Then they measured cortisol levels, and they found that those who had a supporter in the audience had less intense cortisol responses. So just knowing that there was someone who was, rooting for you not to, stumble in your words or, trip and fall, or something like that. So anyway, that's interesting thing there. So other things. So they've done research on social connections in breast cancer. Particularly interesting study here where they had two groups. One had an emotionally supportive weekly group meeting and the other did not. Those in the group therapy condition survived 18 months longer than the control group. That's really that's a huge difference. And you can, kind of extrapolate that you can extrapolate that, and you can also project it onto the sort of other illnesses and other, just problems that people are having, things like that. There's a fascinating study that was done in a nursing home where they basically had two groups, and one group was told they had a lot of autonomy and independence, and they were given this plant that they were supposed to care for, water, make sure it's in the sun. And then they had a control group that was told also about this nursing home and told that they have a lot of autonomy, and they would have this plant in the room, but the plant would be watered by the staff. They wouldn't have to worry about that. So then they found that the group that was told about autonomy was more inclined to attend a free movie, 10 times as likely to participate in games, and 4 times as likely to have basically seemed to have found an improvement in their overall function. Now, there's a key phrase that I forgot to include here, or key word, which was the plant. So they are both. No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I tied that nuts. The one group wasn't told about autonomy. I'm sorry. They were not told about autonomy. They were just told, this nursing home has a great, movie theater. We have games every week, this sort of thing. But then they said, you don't want to have to worry about this plant or anything. Whereas the actual group they were studying, they were told about the autonomy and the camp and the plant. And you see, they perform much better. Other things we know that can improve your health and reduce stress, nature. Find a good bathroom with a view, basically. And this is a view. This is a picture. I saw this on a list of the top 10 best bathroom views in the world. And this bathroom is at the University of California, Santa Barbara. It was down the hall from my office. My office actually looked out over the ocean in a different direction. And I would occasionally get, distracted by dolphins. You could see them out in the waves. And I remember thinking, just cherishing it, because I knew I'm never going to get an office with, where I have to worry about being distracted by dolphins. So anyway, most of us, are not going to get an office like that, or not for very long. But, try to find some nature if you can. I know, these are weird times to do that, but, try to get outside, if possible. Yeah. So, like I said, these are kind of strange times to be doing that. Okay, so I'm going to actually stop and upload this lecture. I think I'll keep it separate from the Chapter 4 lecture. So that one will show up in the modules as well.